Lords of the Fallen has Rivers of Blood at home. If you like bleed builds like I do today, I've got a bleed build that also does poison and fire build up on enemies, and you can cast Inferno spells from range with ease. Let's go! Let me know in the comments what other builds you would like to see. So essentially this build is a dual-wielding short swords build that really focuses on bleed build-up and applying bleed to enemies. For some reason, in every Souls game, like, bleed is like the best build-up. I don't know why, but in Lords of the Fallen, it seems to be the most consistent because you can basically make any enemy trigger that like bleed effect, or I guess, you know, using Elden Ring terms, hemorrhaging when their bleed build-up actually maxes out. And you can see when that has actually happened because the target will start bleeding, and there's like a brief second when you look at the damage numbers that there's like a big pop of damage. Now, I really like using a dual-wield short sword setup here because they have such quick attack animations, plus a really good like charged stab. So the heavy is like a stab, which is great for the corridors, as this game is filled with corridors where you're just going to be slamming your weapon on the wall, and having a charged stab attack like that's really good, so you can actually just attack frontal in front of you. And because we are dual wielding, it's the best for the status build up as well, so you can apply that bleed quickly. And pretty much like I said, every enemy can seemingly bleed, but there are multiple long sections of the game where many of the other status effects just don't really apply very well. Like there's a massive poison swamp area where poison buildup isn't going to work. Same with like fire and inferno. So if you're using like a fully, you know, pyromancer sort of inferno focused build with like fire buildup, you're going to have a hell of a time in one section, sort of in the mid game area. So focusing on bleed here really allows you to apply bleed on enemies, deal damage in that way, but then you've also got the option, so when you're in those areas you can do poison or fire and vice versa. Plus there's plenty of other bleed weapons as well that you can switch out to. Say if, you know, you come across those areas and you just need those resistances, you'll be able to switch to those weapons, so you can sort of avoid that issue. So if you're picking a starting class here, you're really either going to go the Mornstead Infantry, the Blackfeather Ranger, the Exiled Stalker, or the Pirate Cultist. It doesn't matter too much as long as you get a little bit of agility there, and potentially Infernos. We're using that for part of this build as well. So let's break down this build. We'll start with attributes, and agility is your primary attribute as it does scale with the Kukajins Sword and the Bloodlust that we are currently using for physical damage. Now, you can focus on Inferno a little bit more here than I have if you wanted to lean more into the Inferno spells, but I'm really just hitting 22 for this specific spell, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But for the most part here, your only really main focus is going to be on agility for that physical damage, and then vitality because you need that health because enemies hit like an absolute truck in this game, and then endurance for that stamina because we're going to be rolling a lot, right? We're not really blocking or parrying. You're going to roll, you're going to dodge, and you also need that stamina to be able to attack back yourself. So having a decent amount of endurance around the 15-16 mark is definitely good, but focus on agility and vitality first to get that Inferno to 22. So for your spells here, we are using just the default Infernal Orb, which is just a great spell. It doesn't use a whole lot of mana, and it does a solid amount of damage unless they are fire resistant. I'm also using Conflagion, which is just like a stream of fire from your hand. You could use like the Lava Burst if you wanted to. It's just like a bigger version of Infernal Orb. But the main spell that you want to grab here is Adair's Rage, which comes from Doma Rose, which you can run into her just before the Hound's boss fight, and you can buy this from her. And I would highly recommend to buy it at that specific time because you won't see her again for ages. So essentially here, what Adair's Rage does is it increases your physical damage for a period of time, which is just like fantastic for this build using these dual wielding weapons, and we're focusing on that physical damage plus the bleed. It's a great spell. Now, if you need a catalyst or you just like need some of these spells, the Tortured Prisoner is the best way to do this. Now, she can be found under Sky Rest initially, and then she'll move to above Sky Rest depending on like once you've freed her. And I'll cover exactly how to do that in a video that's coming out potentially tomorrow, so keep your hands on the channel. Keep your hands on the channel? Subscribe, you know what I mean. So the gear for this build, so Kukajin's Sword comes from the Forsaken Fen. So in this area, you'll run across Kukajin as she's like essentially frozen in stone. Now, if you kill her, she will drop the sword. There is other ways to complete her quest, but if you just want this sword, you can just kill her and get the sword. The Bloodlust comes from Fitzroy's Gorge. Now, you'll essentially, before you get to Fitzroy's Gorge, there's sort of like this way the path like diverges into either left or the right, and you want to take the left and go all the way up, and there's a boss here which I've already defeated, and then behind that boss there is actually a chest which will have Bloodlust in it, and you can grab it and upgrade both of these from there. In terms of your armor, it's kind of up to you, really. Like, as long as you're medium, at least medium rolling, you could light roll if you wanted to, but you definitely don't want to be heavy rolling with this build because you want some of that protection because we are dodging. So when you do muck up, you do want to make sure you've got physical resistance, but for the most part, it doesn't matter too much. I'm using the Angel of Void set just because it looks cool. Bloodbane Ring adds poison and bleed buildup. So this can be found in a hut just past the Pale Butcher vestige, which is after the boss of the Forsaken Fen area. You'll be able to find this ring there. Any other ring is fine. Like you could run the, say, the stamina ring, for example, that increases like your stamina regen. Doesn't matter too much. Same for your pendant. Really, you only need these specific parts, and then it's sort of hard to get gear that's really beneficial until much later in the game. So this is really all you need for sort of the mid-game area. So as you're leveling up as this build, in the early stages of the game, focus on vitality and a little bit of endurance, right? Your actual weapon scaling is awful, like absolutely awful, until you get the blacksmith and start upgrading the weapon. Still about like, say, +4, +5, sort of that range, it actually starts to matter. But before then, it does not really matter that much. Getting the better HP and stamina is definitely more important. Plus Inferno, right, if you are using more spells. And there are other like short swords that have bleed build-up. You'll see if they have bleed build-up because of the little icon on them that you can run sort of in the early game that are pretty easy to find until you get both of these weapons. And I will say as well, don't invest too much in Inferno, right? Because it only increases the scaling of the fire damage on Bloodlust, unless you're specifically focusing on like a pyro knight build that uses this sort of a thing. You definitely don't want to worry too much about the Inferno stat that you have, as it doesn't increase the physical damage, which is the main focus for this build, right? It's on the bleed and the physical damage. Some quick tips for this build is if you are focusing on using some of those Inferno spells, make sure you're stocking up on mana stones, which you can buy from the blacksmith or just find them out in the world. Now, as mentioned, there are other bleed short swords that you can find in the game, and these are great to switch to when you come across those areas that are resistant to the damage type you're doing, right? So Kukajins Sword with poison, you can switch that out when you're in the poison swamps, or when you're in the fire area, you can switch out Bloodlust. But either of these options are fine. You can still use them, like it's not going to be a huge difference. It's just worth mentioning, right, that they will be resistant to that damage type. Or you could even use salts that can allow you to change the build-ups on your weapons or add different types of build-up if you wanted to go that route. And it goes for every class as well. But like the biggest tip for fighting any kind of tough enemy is to soul flay that person. So when you soul flay them, you pull out their soul and then you can smash that for a while to deal heaps of damage once it goes back into them, and like deal that withered damage. This is great for a build like this specifically because we're not very defensive, right? Like we don't have heavy armor, we're not using a shield, we are very mobile and pretty like squishy for the most part. So when you come across those enemies, those humanoid enemies and stuff that just like have a huge amount of health pool, being able to soul flay them, deal that damage without them actually swinging back at you is really beneficial. So otherwise, just dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge, and swing back with your two swords. And then when you want to deal some damage from range, say, if you just want to pick off enemies, which you will definitely do and should recommend as well. Like there are plenty of enemies in this game that, scenarios where you're supposed to deal range damage because there's enemies sort of, on high ground or distance away. So you can sort of whittle out the pack and then deal with what's left. Also, like if you don't want to use the Bloodlust or even use Inferno spells, you could just use a bow. There's plenty of good bows in the game as well if you just wanted to switch to one and use those instead. Plus there are arrows that apply poison or bleed build up as well, so you can focus on that. But I just personally think that like the way the mana system works is so much better than the range slots, as you get so many more ranged attacks with using something like this, with these catalysts that you can use for mana, compared to like 4 or 5, or depends on what your range slots are, but compared to the other side when you're using those actual physical weapons like bows and crossbows, etc. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, guys. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.